September 1944. Europe has been in flames for 5 years. The German army, which in 1940 had crossed the plains of France in weeks, is bleeding out on two fronts. To the east, the Soviets are advancing relentlessly. To the west, the Allies have broken out of Normandy and are now pursuing a retreating Wehrmacht across Belgium and the Netherlands. The war seems close to its end. British generals feel that the moment is now or never. Then Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery presents a plan. A bold plan. A plan that, if it works, could end the war before Christmas. They call it Operation Market Garden. But 50 miles from the front, hidden among the forests and farms of northeastern Holland, rest two SS armoured divisions that Allied intelligence deliberately underestimates. And at the head of those divisions is a 50-year-old general born in the Harz Mountains, a World War I veteran, fighter pilot and Waffen-SS officer from its earliest days, SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich. No one in London expects what is about to happen. This is the story of the counterattack that destroyed an operation designed to win the war. Before continuing, I want to show you something that I think is especially worthwhile if you are a true World War II enthusiast. Over the past few months, we have worked on a collection dedicated exclusively to one of the most impressive episodes of the conflict, the Battle of Berlin in 1945. We have gathered more than 200 historical photographs, previously unpublished or very rarely seen, organized into a photographic collection that allows you to visually journey through the final days of the Third Reich. This is not simply about the same images that appear over and over again in documentaries. We have searched for lesser-known photographs showing the streets of Berlin, soldiers' vehicles, destroyed buildings, and scenes captured during those decisive days of 1945. The man no one saw coming. Wilhelm Bittrich was born on February 26, 1894, in Wernigerode, a small town nestled on the edge of the Harz mountain range, in what is now the German state of Saxony-Anhalt. His father was a traveling salesman. Childhood in that mountainous region, with its harsh winters and brief summers, shaped a man whom those who knew him would always remember as methodical, cool under pressure, and brutally honest with his superiors. A quality that during World War II put him at odds with the circles of power in Berlin more than once. When the First World War broke out, Bittrich was 20 years old and enlisted as a volunteer. He began his career as an infantry officer, but in 1916 he requested a transfer to the newly formed Air Corps. The transition changed something in him. As a pilot for Jagdstaffel 37, the fighter squadron, Bittrich achieved 3 confirmed aerial victories and earned the Iron Cross First Class. He learned in the air what no tactical book can teach, that the speed of decision, at the exact second the opportunity presents itself, determines who lives and who falls. He never forgot that lesson. After the war, Bittrich briefly joined the Freikorps, the paramilitary units that fought revolutionary unrest in Germany, before joining the regular army of the Weimar Republic. By the early 1930s, he was already a staff officer, and in 1932 he joined the NSDAP. The following year, the SS recruited him to help establish its officer training schools. His experience as a career military man was exactly what Himmler's organization needed to acquire a real professional structure. What followed was a succession of increasingly higher commands within the Waffen-SS divisions. the Deutschland Regiment during the French campaign, the Das Reich Division on the Eastern Front, the SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer in security operations in the Soviet Union. And from February 1943, command of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, with which he fought in Normandy until, on July 1, 1944, he was promoted to command of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. But the months leading up to Arnhem had left their mark. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had fought in Normandy almost uninterruptedly since June, and the weeks in the Falaise pocket between August 12th and 21st, 1944, had been devastating. The Allies had closed the trap and crushed tens of thousands of German soldiers. XXX Corps emerged from that cauldron, but barely recognizable. Armored vehicles were destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel during the retreat. The men were exhausted. The ammunition depots were almost empty. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, made a decision. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps needed rest and reorganization. It was assigned a quiet area, far from the front, in northeastern Holland, about 75 kilometers from the German frontline positions, a sector where, according to XXX himself, nothing particularly significant was happening. By mid-September 1944, the headquarters of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was in Doetinchem, a Dutch town about 25 kilometers east of Arnhem. The 9th SS Division Hohenstaufen, under the temporary command of SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Harzer, had its units scattered around Beekbergen and the Veluwe National Park, in wooded hills perfect for hiding from Allied aviation. The 10th SS Division Frundsberg, under the orders of SS Brigadeführer Heinz Hamel, was concentrated further southeast in Ruhrlo and the surrounding area. Together, the two divisions did not reach 9,000 men. They had left their best equipment in France. In fact, on September 17th, Harzer's units were in the middle of transferring material to Germany. The last rail cars loaded with damaged half-track vehicles were waiting on train tracks to leave that very afternoon for Siegen, where the Hohenstaufen was supposed to regroup and receive replacements, and at that precise moment the sky over the Netherlands filled with airplanes. 10 o'clock in the morning on September 17th. The alarm arrived first through sound. It was the noise that arrived before any report, before any telephone call, a dull roar that grew from the west until it filled the horizon. Those who were out in the open that Sunday morning looked up and saw something that no Western European had witnessed on that scale. Thousands of aircraft advancing in tight formations, fighter escorts sweeping at low altitude among the columns of transports, C-47 Dakotas by the hundreds, Horsa and Waco gliders towed in long lines, medium bombers that had struck German anti-aircraft positions hours earlier. At the Tafelberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, Field Marshal Walter Model was about to sit down at the table for his prompt 1 p.m. lunch when the first explosions and the roar of thousands of aircraft engines burst into the dining room. His administrative assistant, Lieutenant Gustav Sedelhauser, recalled that the Field Marshal was always obsessively punctual for lunch. That day, lunch was not served. Model went outside and saw the paratroopers descending onto the meadows to the west. His first reaction was that the Allies had come to capture him. He thought the objective of that operation was Army Group Board's own headquarters, which had been set up barely 3 weeks earlier in those elegant hotels in Oosterbeek, just 5 kilometers from the Arnhem Bridge. Accompanied by his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Hans Krebs, and several officers, Model hastily abandoned the Tafelberg, leaving his food untouched, his documents, and even his personal belongings. He got into a car and drove east at full speed, stopping several times along the way to alert various area commanders about the landing. The trip that normally took half an hour took more than an hour. Upon his arrival at XXX headquarters in Doetinchem, Model entered in an agitated state. His first words, as XXX himself recalled decades later, were, "They almost got me. They were looking for the headquarters. Imagine that. They almost got me." XXX brought him up to speed on the situation quickly. The paratroopers had landed west of Arnhem. The landing zones were close to the bridge over the Rhine. The scale of the operation, judging by the number of aircraft seen, was massive. Model listened and then fixed his gaze on the map. "The bridges will not be destroyed," he said. "Come what may, the bridges must be defended. Absolutely. The bridges will not be blown up." It was his first order. Bittrich had already reached the same conclusion earlier, although for partially different reasons. If the bridges over the Rhine and the Waal in Arnhem and Nijmegen were destroyed, the German forces south of the river themselves would lose their only route of escape or reinforcement. The order coincided with tactical logic, although Bittrich, in the days following, would view that decision as a potentially catastrophic mistake. But that came later. In those first minutes, Bittrich already had the outline of the response in mind. He took a map. He pointed out two objectives. He told Haase that the Hohenstaufen had to contain and destroy the British airborne forces west of and inside Arnhem. He told Hamel that the Frundsberg had to cross the Rhine as soon as possible, advance south, and block the Nijmegen Bridge before the Allies could consolidate the corridor from the south. The meeting was brief. In a situation where the typical German commander would have waited for formal orders from higher echelon, asked for clarifications and consulted with intermediate levels, Bittrich acted with the speed he had learned in the skies of the First World War. 40 minutes after the initial contact with Model, the commanders of the two SS divisions had their orders and their men were on the move. The battalion that should not have been there. While Bittrich and Model were coordinating in Döttinchem, something even more unforeseen was already happening in the meadows west of Arnhem. SS Sturmbannführer Josef Kraft was 37 years old in September 1944. He was ambitious, energetic, and politically skilled within the hierarchical structure of the Waffen-SS. His unit, the 16th SS Training and Replacement Battalion, was composed primarily of young recruits in various phases of basic training, led by cadres of experienced non-commissioned officers. In total, about 450 men. They had arrived in the Wolfhies area only a few days earlier, displaced because Field Marshal Model had decided to set up his headquarters in Oosterbeek and had literally kicked them out of their previous quarters. Kraft chose to camp in the forests and farms northwest of Oosterbeek, next to the Wolfhies Road. By a stroke of luck, that would change the course of the battle. That spot was almost in the center of the landing zones marked on the Allied planning maps for the British Airborne Division. When the first soldiers of the 1st Parachute Battalion and the 3rd Parachute Battalion touched down in the meadows and wooded areas west of Arnhem, it took Kraft minutes to react. He sent out reconnaissance patrols. He moved his companies eastward, away from the landing zone. He established a blocking line, taking advantage of the railroad embankment and the thickness of the forest. And he divided his 450 men into small groups with numerous machine guns, with orders to fire in short bursts from hidden positions to simulate a much larger force. It was theatre, but it worked. The British battalions advancing along the northern and central routes toward the Arnhem Bridge collided with this makeshift line and came to a halt. The problem was that the radio communications of the British paratroopers were failing systematically. The 22 set radios carried by the battalions suffered constant interference in that wooded terrain, leaving the units without coordination with each other or with the division's headquarters. For Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, commander of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, that very chaos was paradoxically an advantage. His column was advancing along the southern route closest to the Rhine bank, and the breakdown in communications kept their movement anonymous during the critical hours of the first day. Frost was no ordinary officer. A former officer of the Cameronian Regiment and a veteran of multiple airborne operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean, he had earned his reputation as a man who charged forward when others hesitated. His own men described him as someone who, when the situation turned dark, would press ahead. That afternoon of September 17th, his battalion found the gap in Kraft's defensive line and pushed through it almost unopposed. Kraft recorded the combat with the brevity typical of a war report, though with inevitable exaggeration. He claimed in his diary that his battalion's line had kept the mass of British troops away from the bridge. And in a strict sense, he was right. The two main battalions trying to reach the bridge via the northern and central routes were blocked for critical hours. Only Frost's 2nd Battalion slipped through the southern seam before the German line could fully close. At 8 p.m. on September 17th, the men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion reached the northern end of the Rhine bridge in Arnhem and secured it. They had arrived, but they were alone. Grabner's reconnaissance and the first critical decision. Bittrich faced an information problem that afternoon. His forces were on the move, but the terrain between Arnhem and Nijmegen was an unknown. He did not know for sure what had landed there, in what force, or with what intentions. The American airborne forces of the 82nd Airborne Division, which had dropped further south near Groesbeek and Nijmegen, could represent the beginning of a converging attack. He needed eyes in that corridor. The most mobile and best-equipped unit of the Hohenstaufen was the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion, under the command of SS Hauptsturmführer Victor Eberhard Grabner. Born in Leipzig on May 24, 1914, Grabner had fought as a regular army officer in Barbarossa since 1941, before transferring to the Waffen-SS in 1943. His career in the Hohenstaufen had taken him to Normandy, where his aggressiveness and speed of decision caught the attention of his superiors. On August 23, 1944, barely 26 days before Arnhem, he had received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross from his divisional commander Walter Harzer, who had presented the decoration at a ceremony in Hönderloo that was interrupted by the arrival of Allied fighter bombers. The ceremony was completed under the trees. That same September 17th, before the British paratroopers reached the bridge, Grabner's battalion had already crossed the Arnhem Bridge southward with its armoured vehicles to conduct the reconnaissance ordered by Bittrich. It had about 40 vehicles, including armoured half-tracks and reconnaissance cars, and was the most capable force either SS division could deploy at that time. Grabner patrolled the corridor between Arnhem and Nijmegen. He found that the area was reasonably clear of organised Allied forces. The American 82nd Division had not yet reached the Wall bridges, and sent back his report. That night, with the Arnhem Bridge now in British hands from the north, Grabner was ordered to return to Arnhem immediately. Bittrich had gained his eyes. But now the return path for those eyes passed through a bridge controlled by the British. What happened the following morning changed the battle. The bridge. The morning of September 18th. It was approximately 9 in the morning on September 18th when the lookouts of the 2nd Battalion in the upper floors of the buildings flanking the northern end of the bridge first heard and then saw Grabner's column approaching from the south. A Dutch garbage collector making his morning round near the bridge was probably the first casualty of that day when the paratroopers fired upon his truck as he entered the sector they controlled. Frost and his men had already been on the bridge for 16 hours. They had resisted the first nighttime probes by German forces, including the reconnaissance vehicles of the 10th SS Division that had arrived from the south upon reorganizing as Kampfgruppe Brinkmann. The previous night, the British had burned a German truck that tried to cross, leaving its smoking chassis on the northern ramp as an inconvenient obstacle that also proved the bridge could be defended from the surrounding buildings. Now Grabner's column, with its 21 or 22 remaining vehicles, having left some behind in Elst, halfway between Arnhem and Nijmegen, was advancing in formation toward the southern ramp of the bridge. Major Dennis Munford, the brigade's artillery officer, had registered a concentration area as a target, the so-called Mike 1, at the southern end of the bridge. From his position in one of the buildings, he contacted by radio the battery stationed in Oosterbeek and received authorization to open fire. When Grabner's column set into motion, Munford simply uttered the words, "Target, Mike 1." The battery fired without the need for corrections. It was precisely the zone through which the German vehicles had to pass. The artillery fire was too light to stop the armour, but it sowed casualties among the motorcyclists leading the column. The first vehicles, faster wheeled cars, crossed the ramp at full speed, weaving through the burned wreckage of the previous night's truck and the mines the paratroopers had placed on the asphalt during the night. Some of those faster vehicles broke the encirclement and reached the northern side, but what awaited them there were the rifles, anti-tank Piats, and 57mm guns of Frost's men. When the half-tracks loaded with soldiers began to follow the cars, the order to open fire had already been given, and none of them reached the other side without being hit. Sergeant Cyril Robson, a gunner from C Troop, had his 57mm gun in a street west of the bridge, considerably below the level of the ramp. Lieutenant Tony Cox, from a window in the building above him, directed him. Robson fired solid shells against the lateral parapet of the bridge until he opened a V-shaped gap, and from that gap he could fire directly against the sides of the half-tracks passing beside him. The vehicles that were not immediately destroyed were stranded on the ramp, with their upper decks open, exposed to the rain of small arms fire pouring down from all adjacent buildings. The soldiers trying to get out of the flaming vehicles fell onto the asphalt without being able to reach any cover. The combat lasted approximately 2 hours. When it ended, 12 German vehicles were burning on the ramp and the bridge, forming a barricade of twisted iron that would block passage for days. Around 70 SS soldiers had died. Victor Grebner, who, according to some testimonies, was advancing standing up in a staff car captured from the British in Normandy, died during the attack. His body was not identified with certainty in the following days due to the intensity of the fire and the explosions. For Bittrich, who observed the smoking wreckage from his command post, the loss of Grebner and his reconnaissance battalion was not an abstract figure. It was his most capable reconnaissance unit, destroyed in one morning, and the image of the burning half-tracks on the bridge confirmed something he had already intuited. The Arnhem Bridge was not going to be easily retaken. While the remnants of Grabner's battalion that had managed to survive sought refuge in a brick factory south of the bridge, Bittrich made the decision that sealed the fate of Frost's men. He ordered the systematic bombardment of the British positions around the bridge. The Spindler Line and the siege of Arnhem. On that same September 17th, while Frost was marching toward the bridge and Kraft was improvising his blocking line, Bittrich had given another order that would prove just as decisive. SS Obersturmbannführer Ludwig Spindler was the commander of the artillery regiment of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen. Under normal conditions, an artilleryman commands guns and howitzers, not infantry. But Bittrich and Harzer did not have the luxury of using every officer according to their specialty. Spindler was ordered to establish a blocking line west of Arnhem to prevent the massive British airborne forces from advancing toward the bridge. To do so, he would have to gather whatever was available. He started with 120 men from his own regiment, acting as infantry. In the following hours, he was joined by regular army units, Luftwaffe personnel from non-commissioned officer schools, assault gun units, and remnants of other units. Kampfgruppe Spindler grew organically throughout the day, positioning itself in a line running north-south toward the Rhine, gradually closing off each of the routes that the British battalions were trying to use to reach the bridge. 2 German female telephone operators working at the Arnhem telephone exchange made a decision that afternoon that shifted the flow of information. They stayed at their posts all night, reporting on British unit movements and helping position the Spindler line at optimal points. General Bittrich, upon learning of this, personally awarded them the Iron Cross. The Spindler line, referred to by the Germans as Sperlini Spindler, was the axis of what Harzer called the Harzer Block, a defensive mechanism intended to seal off Arnhem from the west and isolate the bridge from the bulk of the British forces still landing in the drop zones several kilometers away. Alongside the Spindler line, other groups operated, such as Kampfgruppe von Alverden with its assault guns, covering the flanks and defending the narrow city streets where the British would try to advance in the coming days. Simultaneously, from the western sector, Lieutenant General Hans von Tettau was organizing another force under Model's direct orders. Group von Tettau was formed from a motley mix of available units in the area: the Arnhem SS Non-Commissioned Officer School, a battalion of Dutch SS volunteers, a Luftwaffe training regiment, and several other garrison units. Its mission was to attack the British landing zone from the west, pressing the airborne forces that had not yet reached the combat front. It was the double hammer model wanted: Harzer closing from the east and north, and Tettau pressing from the west. On September 18th, while the remains of Grabner's column were still burning on the bridge, approximately 2,000 paratroopers of Brigadier Shan Hackett's 4th Parachute Brigade began landing in the drop zones. They landed under fire from Kampfgruppe von Tettau. Many lost their heavy equipment during the descent itself. Those who survived the landing under fire found the route to Arnhem blocked by the Spindler Line, and thus the British began to bleed. Hamel and the crossing at Pannerden. While Arnhem was turning into a labyrinth of urban combat, Heinz Hamel had a different problem. SS Brigade Führer Heinz Hamel, the commander of the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, was 42 years old in 1944. His men affectionately called him Der alte Frundsberg, the old Frundsberg, even though 42 was not exactly old age. The nickname spoke more of his authority and presence than his actual age. Hamel had spent the days leading up to the operation in Berlin on division business, and on September 17th he rushed back to the Netherlands when he received news of the Allied landing. When he arrived at the Frundsberg headquarters in Velp, about 3 kilometers northeast of Arnhem, he found his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Petsch, who brought him up to speed on the situation with an exhausted look. "Thank God you're back," was the first thing he said to him. Hamel then called Bittrick personally and said he was going to see him. Bittrick hadn't slept either, Hamel recalled years later. When I walked in, he began explaining the situation to me, bent over his maps, with visible anger and frustration. The order for Hamel was clear: move his division south, cross the Rhine, and reach Nijmegen to block the bridges over the Waal before the British XXX Corps could access them from the south. The problem: the Arnhem Bridge, which was the only connection between the north bank and the south bank of the Rhine in that area, was in Frost's hands. Hamel looked at the map and understood the magnitude of the problem. His entire division, vehicles, armor, artillery men, would have to cross the Rhine by a ferry in the village of Pannerden, about 8 kilometers southeast of Arnhem. A river ferry crossing an entire motorized division. The Rhine in that area is more than 200 meters wide, with variable currents. The available barges were slow. The roads leading to the landing stage turned into mud within hours under the weight of military vehicle traffic. Bittrich, anticipating the problem, had already ordered ferry operations to begin before Hamel arrived. But reality exceeded all time forecasts. In the first 24 hours, Hamel's engineers managed to cross barely 2 infantry battalions to the other side of the river. Tanks and heavy vehicles waited on the north bank in long lines. Allied air raids during the day forced operations to halt and resume only after nightfall. Hamel asked Bittrick before leaving for Pannerden why the Nijmegen Bridge was not destroyed to prevent the Allies from crossing it. Bittrick answered honestly. He had raised the question with Model repeatedly. Model always rejected it. The bridges belonged to Germany. They would not be destroyed. Hamel listened and left. In his heart, he considered that if circumstances changed, he would do what he deemed militarily necessary. That ambiguity between Model's order and the tactical interpretation of his subordinates had consequences in the following days. Frost's 88 hours, the night of September 17th to 18th, 18 to 19, 19 to 20. The 2nd Parachute Battalion resisted at the northern end of the bridge for 88 hours without receiving reinforcements, without supply lines, with communications cut off from the rest of the division, and with ammunition reserves dwindling with every passing hour. Frost's men occupied a network of buildings around the northern bridgehead. Mr. Ter Horst's house, the brigade building, the customs warehouse, several houses along the Marktplatz. They had dug positions in the basements, turned windows into firing points, and filled door frames with sandbags. The noise was constant. The clatter of German machine guns, the dull thud of mortars, the cracking of walls as they were hit by projectiles. The first weeks of the Dutch autumn in 1944 were damp. The Rhine exhaled mist in the mornings and the nights cooled rapidly. The basements of the buildings where the wounded waited smelled of blood and improvised antiseptic, and medics worked with what they had, which grew less each day. Bittrich told Hamel that the bridge had to be reopened as soon as possible. Model pressured him every day. In his own later account, Bittrich reproduced the phrase Model repeated at each visit to headquarters, "When will this finally be over?" And Bittrich would reply, "In all my career as a soldier, I have never seen men fight so hard." Model would respond without emotion, "I want that bridge." Kampfgruppe Knaust, the unit under the command of Major Hans-Peter Knaust, operating with some armoured vehicles, including models of Tigers and Panzer IVs recovered from various units, began its attacks against Frost's positions on the afternoon of September 18th. The Germans were no longer trying to capture the defenders. They were trying to destroy them. The method was methodical and brutal. Howitzer fire directed at the ground floors of buildings to collapse the entire structures. The buildings fell upon their defenders and their wounded. Those who survived the collapse crawled out to more exposed positions. A miniature city that the paratroopers had turned into a fortress was reduced block by block under German artillery fire. On September 20th, during one of the fights, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost received shrapnel wounds in both legs. He was taken to the basement serving as a dressing station. Command of the active combatants fell to Major Frederick Goff. That same afternoon, the Germans proposed and agreed to a 2-hour truce to evacuate the wounded. Frost, on a stretcher, was taken along with hundreds of other wounded to hospitals under German control, where they would become prisoners of war. On September 21st, the fighting continued. The Germans of Kampfgruppe Knaust methodically reduced the last pockets of resistance. By midday, the northern end of the bridge was back in German hands. The survivors, mostly wounded, were taken prisoner. The 2nd Parachute Battalion, which had arrived at the bridge with more than 700 men, had left most of them in the destroyed houses or on the asphalt of the adjacent streets. 88 hours. German engineers began clearing the charred remains of Grabner's vehicles from the ramp immediately after regaining control. They were in a hurry. The priority was to reopen the passage as soon as possible so that Hamel's forces could move south to reinforce Nijmegen. The battle for Nijmegen. On September 20th, further south, the situation for the Allies in the corridor was different but equally critical. The forces of the British XXX Corps, under the command of Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, had left their starting positions in Belgium on September 17th with the objective of advancing nearly 100 kilometers along a single main road to reach the Arnhem Bridge in 42 hours. That road passed through Valkenswaard, Eindhoven, Veghel and Nijmegen on an elevated and narrow layout so exposed to the flanks that the American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division had already begun calling it Hell's Highway, before XXX Corps had even covered the first tenth of its route. The troubles began in Sun, a few kilometers from Eindhoven. General Maxwell Taylor's 101st Airborne Division had landed north of Eindhoven on September 17th with the mission of capturing the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal in the village of Sun. The American paratroopers reached the bridge, but the Germans blew it up at the very last moment when the first men of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment were just a few meters from its headers. The roar of the explosion shook the surrounding fields and hurled steel beams into the canal. American engineers immediately set to work to build a makeshift pontoon bridge, but the process took nearly 36 hours. The Vanguard tank of XXX Corps arrived in Son late on September 18th to find the emergency footbridge still unfinished. In Nijmegen, 40 kilometers further north, the situation for General James Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division was no less complicated. Gavin was 37 years old and the youngest brigadier general in the American Army. His men had jumped in 3 combats prior to Holland, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and he himself had jumped with them in every operation. They knew what it was like to fight from the very first second. But Nijmegen was a city of 90,000 inhabitants with a 9-span bridge over the Waal that measured nearly 500 meters in length, and Hamel's forces had been building defensive positions on its southern approaches since the afternoon of September 17th. Gavin also had another structural problem. Browning had given him the explicit order not to try to take the Nijmegen Bridge until he had secured the Groesbeek Heights, southeast of the city. Those heights dominated the surrounding terrain and were the only position from which the Germans could accumulate forces to fall upon the corridor's flanks from the Reichswald. The order had tactical logic, but it meant that the Nijmegen Bridge went without a decisive attack for hours, while Hamel's forces arrived from Pannerden and settled into their positions. When XXX Corps and Gavin finally coordinated the assault on the bridge on September 20th, the solution imposed was as bold as it was desperate. Cross the Waal in assault boats at the point where the river is more than 400 meters wide, under direct enemy fire in broad daylight. The designated unit was the 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by 26-year-old Major Julian Cook. Cook learned of the mission and described it as if he were being asked to recreate the Omaha beach landing all by himself. Many of his men had never been in a small boat. The assault boats, 26 in total, took until late afternoon to arrive. Built of green canvas with 19-foot plywood bottoms, they measured barely 76 centimeters from gunwale to bottom. Each was supposed to carry 13 paratroopers and 3 engineers to row them. But in many of the boats, there were only 2 oars instead of the expected 8. The men would have to use the butts of their rifles. At 3 p.m. on September 20th, with the Irish Guards' tanks firing a screen of smoke over the north bank and partially covering it, First Lieutenant Patrick Malloy heard someone shout, "Go!" and his entire row of men grabbed the sides of the boats and broke into a run toward the shore. The first wave, some 260 people from Companies H and I plus the engineers, entered the water under conditions that Captain Karl Kappel later described as total confusion. Some boats ran aground in the mud of the low banks. Others capsized upon entering. Others spun out of control, dragged by the Waal's 8 to 10 kilometers per hour current. Several men fell into the water. One had to be rescued by Kappel, who dove into the river and pulled him afloat, reaching the opposite shore exhausted. The Oosterbeek Cauldron. While the events in Nijmegen and at the Arnhem Bridge were unfolding, the bulk of the British 1st Airborne Division, under the command of Major General Robert Urquhart, had become trapped in an increasingly shrinking perimeter around the village of Oosterbeek. Urquhart had spent the first 36 hours of the battle unable to direct anything. On the afternoon of September 17th, when he tried to advance toward the bridge to see the situation for himself, he became trapped along with Brigadier Gerald Lathbury when urban combat cut off his way back. He spent the night of September 17th to 18th hidden in the basement of a Dutch house, aware that his division was fighting several kilometers away and he had no way to communicate with it. Only on the afternoon of September 18th, after an agonizing return through the fighting, was Urquhart able to resume command. And by then, the picture was clear. Most of the division would not reach the bridge. The routes were blocked. September 19th, the 3rd day of the operation, is considered the irreversible turning point by historians who have studied the battle in detail. That day, 4 British battalions attempted a last desperate attack to carve a path toward the Arnhem Bridge through the city streets. They collided with Spindler's positions and the assault guns of Kampfgruppe von Alverden. In the narrow streets of the urban centre, the paratroopers advanced in columns that German flanks could batter from both sides simultaneously. Casualties were so severe that several of those battalions ceased to exist as effective combat units. Only small groups managed to withdraw toward Oosterbeek. Haase, with the structure of the blockade now consolidated, went about organising his combat groups around the perimeter the British had established in Oosterbeek. The Hartenstein Hotel, with its wide lawn and tree-lined avenues, became Urquhart's headquarters. The Oosterbeek Church, the Valkenburglan Villa, the Schoenord Hotel, the Ter Horst family houses by the Rhine, these buildings marked the limits of what the Germans called the Kessel, the Cauldron, and the British simply the perimeter. On September 22nd, Model formally subordinated Group von Tettau to the command of Bittrich's 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which already held operational control of all German forces committed against the 1st Airborne Division. Bittrich transferred close tactical command to Harzer, who proceeded to direct the siege from the Arnhem sector, tightening the perimeter with his units from the east and north, while von Tettau pressed from the west. The days from September 22nd to 25th passed as a form of continuous but measured violence. The Germans did not assault the perimeter en masse, because Bittrich knew that the British paratroopers fought well from defensive positions and that a frontal assault would cost more than it would gain. The chosen method was artillery siege, systematic mortar and howitzer bombardment against the perimeter hour after hour, creating continuous casualties that the British could neither replace nor adequately evacuate. Urquhart described those days as the hardest experience of his military life. Kate ter Horst, a Dutch woman whose house became an improvised dressing station, cared for hundreds of wounded over several days in her rooms and garden, with the bombardment falling uninterruptedly around her. Her name became forever linked to the battle. The aerial supply drops, which were supposed to bring ammunition and provisions to the Oosterbeek perimeter, kept failing. The pilots of the RAF and USAAF transport planes flew under German anti-aircraft fire with extraordinary bravery, but the containers systematically fell outside the perimeter. The Germans recovered the Allied materiel. In some cases, the paratroopers within the perimeter watched from their positions as food and ammunition containers descended right among the German lines. The Poles in Driel. On September 21st, after a two-day delay caused by bad weather in England, Brigadier General Stanislaw Sosabowski's 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade finally jumped onto the meadows south of the Rhine, near the village of Driel. Sosabowski was 52 years old and had spent the days leading up to the operation expressing his doubts about the plan. When he was told at the September 12th briefing that the Polish paratroopers would land south of the Rhine, while their equipment and ammunition depots went by glider to the north, the Polish general pointed out the obvious problem. What would happen if the bridge was still in German hands when he arrived? The answer he received was that by then the bridge would have been taken. Sosabowski was not convinced, but remained silent at the meeting. By the time the Poles reached Dutch soil on September 21st, the Arnhem Bridge had been back in German hands for several days. The ferry they were supposed to use to cross north and join Urquhart had been destroyed, and from the brick factory south of the bridge, the remnants of the SS Reconnaissance Battalion that had survived Grebner's attack, now reorganized into a small defensive force, harassed the Poles from high ground, pinning them down in the mud under machine gun fire. Attempts to cross the Rhine at night with whatever was available mostly failed. The currents were strong. The makeshift boats found by Dutch engineers and the Poles themselves were not enough, either in number or capacity. On the night of September 22nd to 23rd, only about 50 Polish soldiers managed to cross into the Oosterbeek perimeter. On the night of September 23rd to 24th, about 150 more. Numbers that did not change the balance of forces inside the encirclement. On September 23rd, the situation to the south also became complicated. The Germans launched counterattacks against the rear of XXX Corps' corridor, temporarily cutting supply lines. Hamel had positioned his combat groups, including tanks and 88mm anti-tank guns, in the village of Elst, 10 kilometers south of Arnhem, along the elevated road that was the only viable route for British armor. The armored guards of XXX Corps tried to advance along that road repeatedly, but the combination of the elevated highway, which completely exposed the silhouettes of the tanks, with Hamel's guns on both sides, turned the advance into a deadly exercise. XXX Corps reached Driel, but could advance no further north. Arnhem remained 10 kilometers away, an insurmountable distance under those conditions. On September 24th, 60 Tiger tanks arrived in Model's sector, reinforcing German positions. The arrival of the heavy equipment, which had been traveling from Germany's interior, confirmed that any theoretical possibility of an Allied breakthrough in that area was now purely academic. The decision of September 25th, Urquhart received the order to withdraw on September 25th. It was no surprise. He had known for days that the situation was unsustainable. The Oosterbeek perimeter had been reduced to a rectangle of approximately 900 meters by 700 meters, with several thousand men, combatants, wounded, rearguard personnel, medics crammed inside. Ammunition for heavy weapons was exhausted. Food arrived in quantities that barely allowed them to function. The wounded accumulated in the aid stations with no possibility of evacuation. On the 24th, the division's medical colonel, Graham Warwick, requested a truce to evacuate the wounded. Bittrich granted it and received Warwick personally. The British doctor recalled the meeting as strange and almost surreal. In the middle of the war, facing an SS general, he was served refreshments and the conversation was polite. Bittrich authorized the evacuation that afternoon. Nearly 250 stretcher cases and 200 lightly wounded were transferred to Apeldoorn in German jeeps and ambulances. The night of September 25th to 26th was Operation Berlin. The name was a dark irony, the most ambitious objective of the Allied plan, now reduced to a nocturnal survival retreat. Urquhart organized the withdrawal with as much silence as possible. The men wrapped their boots in cloth to dampen the sound of their footsteps. They advanced in single file with a hand on the shoulder of the soldier in front to avoid losing contact in the dark. The wounded who could not move were left behind, along with the volunteer medics who chose to stay to care for them. The night was dark and rainy. The Rhine at that point is about 250 meters wide. Canadian and British engineers had provided rowboats and pneumatic canoes. German mortar and machine gun fire erupted at various times, causing casualties in the waiting ranks, but the darkness and rain partially covered the crossing. More than 2,398 men managed to cross to the south before dawn, among them Major General Urquhart. About 300 of those who attempted to cross died or were taken prisoner during the operation. And by the dawn of September 26th, hundreds more men were still trapped on the north bank, unable to cross in broad daylight under German fire. They were captured. The British 1st Airborne Division had started the operation with more than 10,000 men. In the final tally, 1,485 died in combat, and more than 6,400 were captured. The exact number of wounded who could not be evacuated and fell into German hands exceeded 3,000. The price and the question. Operation Market Garden demonstrated something that military planners of the era knew in theory, but forgot in practice. That the intelligence you do not have is worth more than the intelligence you have wrong. Allied intelligence services knew of the presence of armoured SS units in the Arnhem area. They had known since at least September 10th, when the headquarters of General Dempsey's British Second Army had issued an internal memo warning of the presence of panzer formations in the process of reorganization in Holland. The Arnhem Resistance Network knew it. The city's clandestine intelligence chief, Henri Knapp, had sent reports throughout the week prior to the drop identifying the presence of armoured units in the forests north and northeast of Arnhem. One of his agents had detected tanks with distinctive markings, letters shaped like an inverted F with a ball at the base, which Knapp identified using a captured German manual as belonging to the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen. And the young intelligence officer of the Allied 1st Airborne Corps, Major Brian Urquhart, no relation to General Roy Urquhart, knew it. On September 15th, he had obtained 5 aerial photographs from an RAF reconnaissance flight over the Arnhem area, where, using a magnifying glass, the silhouette of German armoured vehicles could be clearly seen, some less than 2 kilometers from the landing zones marked on the operations maps. That same September 15th, Brian Urquhart took the photographs to General Browning's office. He placed them on the table. Browning studied them one by one. According to Urquhart's own reconstruction years later, Browning said, "I wouldn't worry about those things if I were you." And then, pointing to the armoured vehicles in the images, "They're probably not operational anyway." Urquhart insisted, operational or not, They were still tanks with cannons. Browning did not change his position. The following day, September 16th, SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, issued its intelligence summary number 26, which included the explicit warning that the 9th SS Panzer Division and presumably the 10th have been reported withdrawing toward the Arnhem area in Holland. There they will probably pick up new tanks from a depot reported in the Cleves area. That summary had caused such concern to General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, that Smith had approached Montgomery personally to express his doubts about the operation. Montgomery had dismissed him with the same response. The divisions were too depleted to be a real threat. Browning, in turn, informed his own Chief of Staff of Urquhart's concerns. The institutional response was to characterize the young intelligence officer as someone whose perspective was tinged with nervous exhaustion and who tended to be somewhat hysterical, probably from overwork. The day after showing the photographs to Browning, Urquhart was visited by the Corps medical officer, who suggested he rest and take leave. They told him to go home. He was removed from active duty the eve of the largest operation he could have participated in during his career. The institutional dynamic that triggered that decision is one of the most studied in academic analyses of Market Garden. Brigadier Gordon Walsh, Chief of Staff of the British 1st Airborne Corps, summarized it candidly in subsequent statements. HQ 21st Army Group was our primary source of intelligence, and we took what we were given as truth. And the official truth emanating from Montgomery's headquarters was that the German army in Holland was on the verge of collapse, an optimism that no one in the chain of command found convenient to question publicly when the operation was already underway. That optimism had understandable but dangerous roots. After the breakout from Normandy in August, German divisions had retreated across France and Belgium in a route that appeared to Allied observers to be a total disintegration. Antwerp had fallen on September 4th with practically no combat. The German army in the west seemed finished. What Market Garden's planners failed to detect, or refused to detect, was that the Wehrmacht, as it had demonstrated in the First World War and on the Eastern Front, possessed an extraordinary capacity to reconstitute its forces when given even a brief interval for reorganization. And British XXX SS Panzer Corps had already been reconstituting itself in the forests northeast of Arnhem for over 2 weeks. There is a detail that historians frequently cite as the most precise symbol of that perceptual failure. On September 11th, when the advance team of Model's headquarters arrived in Oosterbeek to inspect potential quarters, one of its members, Lieutenant Gustav Sedelhauser, visited the village's hotels and was particularly pleased with the facilities of the Hartenstein and the Tafelberg. He noted in particular the magnificent accommodations and commented that the team had not been able to stay anywhere for more than a few days for weeks, and that he hoped to be able to do laundry. Sedelhauser chose the Tafelberg for model. The Hartenstein, with its expansive gardens and additional rooms, would be for the staff. By September 15th, Model's Army Group B headquarters was fully operational in Oosterbeek, 3 kilometers from the drop zones planned for the British 1st Airborne Division. The Dutch resistance network knew it. One of Knap's agents had observed a checkered white, red and black banner over the entrance of the Tafelberg, the ensign of a German Army Group commander, and had communicated it. The report reached Allied channels, but neither did that data modify official estimates. When the battle ended, questions about who had failed and where quickly multiplied. General Montgomery defended Market Garden until the end of his life as an operation that came 90% successful. It was a claim that Arnhem survivors found difficult to share. The operation had taken 4 bridges of the 5 planned, yes, but the 5th was the only one that mattered. And the failure at that bridge had consequences that a percentage could not summarize. Holland remained partially occupied for another winter, with consequences that killed more civilians than the combatants who fell during the 9 days of the operation. General Browning, for his part, coined the phrase that unintentionally became Market Garden's epitaph. Days before the jump, during one of the planning briefings, someone pointed out that the distance between XXX Corps' starting point and the Arnhem Bridge was too great to cover in the anticipated time. Browning replied, "Perhaps we are trying to go a bridge too far." The phrase, "going a bridge too far," was attributed to him by Cornelius Rhine decades later, and Rhine used it as the title of his 1974 book on the operation. Browning always denied having uttered it. What no one denied was that the map, with its clean arrows and precise schedules, did not show the forests northeast of Arnhem, filled with men of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps waiting for a reason to move. Bittrich gave them that reason on September 17th, within minutes. The difference between the Allied capacity to process available information and the German capacity to act on the minimal information they possessed was exposed with complete clarity in the first hours of the operation. The Allies knew where the panzers were. The Germans did not know where the paratroopers were going until they saw them fall. And even so, the German response was faster. That asymmetry between what is known and what is done with what is known is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Battle of Arnhem. Not the only one, but certainly the most uncomfortable for those who made the decisions. What the map did not show. Operation Market Garden demonstrated something that military planners of the era knew in theory but forgot in practice. That the intelligence you do not have is worth more than the intelligence you have wrong. Allied intelligence services knew of the presence of armoured SS units in the Arnhem area. Major Brian Urquhart, no family relation to the general, intelligence officer of the Allied 1st Airborne Corps, had presented aerial photographs showing armoured vehicles in the forests northeast of Arnhem. The operations intelligence commander was relieved of his duties a few days before Market Garden, officially due to exhaustion. The photographs were dismissed as irrelevant. It was assumed that the divisions were too depleted to pose a real danger. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commander of the Airborne Corps, plays a complex role in the historical analyses of the operation. It was he who ultimately approved Urquhart's plans, including the drop zones located far from the bridge and the staggered arrival schedule. It was he who received and dismissed the intelligence warnings. And it was he, according to General Sosabowski and other testimonies, who responded to the Polish commander's concerns about the plan with the phrase that became famous, "But my dear Sosabowski, the Red Devils and the brave Poles can do anything." Sosabowski was not reassured. When in September 1944 he asked for his orders in writing, he explained to Browning that he did not want to be held responsible for the disaster he foresaw. History proved Sosabowski right, although that correction came far too late and at too high a price. On the German side, the combination of Bittrich's presence with Model's casual presence in the exact spot where the paratroopers landed constituted a confluence of factors that no Allied plan could have fully anticipated. Model was the commander of Army Group B. That he was sleeping and eating 3 kilometers from the drop zones was a historical coincidence. That this coincidence meant the German response began not after hours of confusion and debate in the command chains, but within minutes of the first landing, with the region's top commander directly giving orders to the commander of the only available armoured corps, was decisive. Model and Bittrich in the same place, on the same day, with the combined authority to trigger an immediate response. The field after the battle. In the days following the end of the fighting in Oosterbeek, the Dutch civilian population took to the streets. Before the war, Oosterbeek had about 10,000 inhabitants. Most had remained in the area during the 9 days of combat, taking refuge in basements, under stairwells, or in any space that offered some protection against the constant fire. The Ter Horst family, whose house was used as a dressing station, welcomed more than 300 wounded into their rooms and garden during the days of the siege. Mrs. Kate Ter Horst walked through the rooms reading psalms to the wounded who were waiting to be treated or dying while they waited. When the fighting ended, the residents of Oosterbeek found their town transformed. The hotel gardens were crisscrossed with trenches. The avenue trees had been stripped bare by shrapnel. The downtown buildings bore the marks of shell impacts. Windows blocked with sandbags, collapsed facades. The smell of gunpowder and turned earth took weeks to dissipate. The Allied dead were gathered and initially buried in makeshift field cemeteries. In time, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission established the Oosterbeek War Cemetery on the grounds of the Hartenstein estate, where today more than 1,750 Allied soldiers rest in orderly graves beneath the oaks of the garden. Most were 20-year-old youths from England, Scotland, Wales, Poland and Ireland. The veterans who survived returned to Oosterbeek for the first time in 1945 and continued to return every year. The annual commemoration ceremony, held in the Oosterbeek Cemetery every third weekend of September, drew battle survivors for decades. Dutch children from Oosterbeek laid flowers on the graves at the first ceremony in 1945, and that tradition continued generations after the last veterans passed away. The bridge over the Rhine, the John Frost Bridge, is still there. Cars and trucks of a prosperous and peaceful European city cross it every day, without their passengers necessarily thinking of Grabner's burning half-tracks or the damp basements where Frost's men held out for their 88 hours. But the bridge has a name, and that name says it all. Operation Market Garden failed in its primary objective. The Rhine was not crossed in September 1944. The Siegfried Line was not flanked. The Ruhr Valley was not reached. The war on the Western Front continued until May 1945, with the Allies finally crossing the Rhine in March of that year, at Remagen, at a very different point, after months of additional combat that cost hundreds of thousands of more lives on both sides. The Netherlands paid an additional price. The northern provinces of the Netherlands, partially liberated by Market Garden's corridor but blocked by the failure at Arnhem, remained under German occupation during the winter of 1944 to 1945. That winter went down in Dutch history as the Hunger Winter, the Hunger Winter. The food shortages caused by the German blockade of occupied territories and transport shutdowns killed between 18,000 and 22,000 Dutch civilians between November 1944 and May 1945. The decision to launch Market Garden, made in the weeks of euphoria following the liberation of Paris and the breakthrough of the German line in Normandy, started from the assumption that the German army was on the verge of total collapse. On paper, the logic was understandable. On the ground, the reality was different. What the map did not show were the 9,000 exhausted but functional men of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps resting in the forests of Holland. And what no aerial photograph could capture was the speed with which a capable commander can transform a worn-out force into an effective response when circumstances demand it. Dietrich did it in hours. That was enough.